Hello to everybody and welcome to the fourth and final session in the current UK-China Dialogue series organised by the Oxford Prospects and Global Development Institute. The series, which it has been my privilege to co-convene with the director of the Institute, Dr. Shidong Wang, has looked at complex global issues, social, political, economic and ecological, issues that are fueling division and conflict in society and between nations. Leading academics from a wide range of disciplines have provided us with expert analysis, analysing trends and looking at the prospects for both the challenges and the opportunities in these crises for being transformed into opportunities. The question of how to rebuild and restore trust and cooperation in the global, regional and national domains has been the central theme running through the discussions and will surely feature today again when global governance, trade and fragile economic relations take centre stage. For this final session, it is my pleasure to hand over to our host for today, Professor Reshaping, Associate Professor and Deputy Director of the International Affairs Office at East China University of Science and Technology. Over to you.
Okay, thanks to Bally's, dear participants. My name is Reshaping and welcome to Oxford Prospects and the Global Development Institute in conversation events. So as we know, over the past decades, national economies are merged into an integrated global economic system. We may call it globalization. So WTO, as we know, which manages the world trading system, is of importance in global governance. Nevertheless, currently it is facing a big crisis and its primary function are eroding. In particular, as we know, the appellate body has been deadlocked even today. There's many WTO members have engaged in the discussion on the reform of WTO. So will the WTO reform possible? And what are the challenges and opportunities for that? And how do the WTO and other international organizations, such as World Bank, cooperate to revive the world economy after the COVID-19 pandemic? I think all these issues are worth considering in the current moment. So today, I'm very happy to introduce two speakers who will share their deep understanding with us. So the first speaker is Professor Goldin. Goldin was the founding director of the Oxford Martin School from 2006 to 2016. He is currently director of the Oxford Martin Program on Technological and Economic Change. Before coming to Oxford, Professor Goldin was vice president of the World Bank from 2003 and 2006. He served on bank's senior management team and led the bank's collaboration with the United Nations and other partners, as well as key countries. From 1996 to 2001, he was chief executive and managing director of the Development Bank of Southern Africa and served as an advisor to President Mandela. He succeeded in transforming the bank to become the leading agent of the development in the 14 countries of Southern Africa. He has been principal economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London, and the program director at the OECD Development Center in Paris. So welcome, Professor Yang Goldin. And our second speaker is Professor Yang Guohua. Professor Yang now is working at Tsinghua University Law School. Professor Yang participated in the negotiations on China WTO accession and the drafting of the accession protocol and working party report. Professor Yang led a group of experts checking Chinese law and regulations against the WTO rules and China commitments. He was the first director for WTO legal affairs within the Ministry of Commerce, responsible for WTO cases related to China. Professor Yang strongly advocated for the multilateral trading system represented by the WTO. He has a rich background on trade policy making and international cooperation. Now he's Executive Vice Chairman of WTO Law Research Society, and also Associate Director at Journal of World Trade, a very famous journal. He was the IP advisor at the Chinese Embassy in the United States, Washington, and was selected as WTO appellate body member candidate in 2016. Professor Yang is also a member of multi-party interim appeal arrangement. So here are basic information about our today's two speakers. So again, thanks for your participation in this event. And during the discussion, we will collect some questions from you, audience. So for those who want to ask questions, so please click the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. So we will pick your questions during the discussion. Yeah, thanks again. So so now let's begin our conversation. First of all, because we know our two speakers are very busy. So first of all, could you please introduce your current research interest or programs that you are conducting? So maybe Professor Yang, we start with you and later on by Professor Goldin. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dele, for your kind invitation. And it's really a great pleasure to be here and to have some conversation with Professor Goldin and also the audience. You know, there's a lot of things are happening right now, and my economic interests are basically three aspects. Number one is the U.S.-China relationship. As you know, the first high-level face-to-face dialogue between U.S. and China are happening right now, and we do not have many encouraging news right from the dialogue. And the second aspect is WTO reform. I'm tracking the WTO reform and trying also at the same time to consult my former colleagues in the Ministry of Commerce to see what China can do in the WTO reform. Number three, last is the most recent developments, basically RCEP, CAI between China and EU, and also CPTPP. What are the legal impacts on China's legal system? For example, what China need to do to amend laws or make new laws to accommodate the international obligations from the RCEP, CII, or the forthcoming CPTPP. Basically, my focus, my academic interests are the three areas. Thank you, Dele.
Thanks, Professor Yang. So please, Professor Goldin. So.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Dr. Penn, and it's a pleasure to be with Professor Yang, who's a very deep expert on the WTO and many other things. I look forward to learning a lot during this session. My own interests are pretty macro. I'm very focused on my title is the Professor of Globalization and Development at Oxford University. So I'm at the moment thinking deeply about the future of globalization and trade, but other aspects as well. I've just finished a book called Rescue on the pandemic and its impact in many dimensions: inequality, future of cities, future of work, and the future of global economy. I run 3 research programs in the Oxford Martin School at the moment. The first is on technological and economic change, where the main focus is on how artificial intelligence robotics and automation are likely to impact on productivity, on firms, and on country competitiveness. The second program is on the future of work, thinking about how technological change is likely to change the nature of work, robotics, automation, etc., but also where will work of the future be, what will the content of the work be, and how does one address possible implications of very large unemployment resulting from technological change. And the third focus is called the future of development, which is really thinking about what does this all mean, what is the big macro trends on globalization, on climate change, on other changes globally, together with the opportunities on the ground mean for the opportunities facing African, Asian, and Latin American low and middle income countries. So those are the three big research groups that I currently have in the Martin School.
Okay, thanks again, Professor Goldin. Very meaningful and interesting programs and research. So as we know, Professor Goldin, you are the senior expert in globalization. Actually, just now you have mentioned something about globalization. So as we know, when we talk about globalization, we mainly discuss the globalization of markets and the globalization of production. But as you said today, the technology is playing a big role in globalization. So maybe the second question start with you. So what is globalization in your understanding? In particular, does it have some new characters or differences compared with our previous understanding? Thanks.
Yeah, globalization is a much misunderstood concept and means many things to different people. Some see it as a term of very negative term. For me, globalization is flows across national borders of anything, of ideas, of technologies, of goods, of services, of finance, of people. These are all dimensions of globalization, and they've accelerated greatly for a number of reasons. One is the number of countries has increased. There's 100 new countries in the world over the last 100 years. There's 40 new countries over the last 50 years. And the flows have increased also because of liberalization, the opening up of China, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Maastricht Treaty, NAFTA, the trade agreements, all of these, and of course the creation of a digital economy, which really leads to borderless in many respects flows. This conversation is an aspect of globalization using Zoom. So the globalization is constantly transforming. I do not believe that we are deglobalizing. In fact, there's much more globalization in 2020 there was than in 2019 in many respects, particularly scientific globalization, the spread of the genomics around the pandemic, scientific collaboration to develop vaccines, and even some aspects of finance and trade increased. And of course, digital traffic increased very, very rapidly in 2020. Some supply chain changes, we can talk about the reasons for that, but I believe that they are not because of the pandemic. They started well before the pandemic. The structural changes in supply chains, in manufacturing, services becoming a bigger part of the global economy. People flows were fundamentally disrupted, but they will return as travel returns. So I do not see that as a fundamental change. The only single change I can identify as a result, which I think will be permanent as a result of the pandemic, is that of business travel. I think we have seen a structural change in business travel, and that it will be permanently less than it was before for a number of reasons. One is that we've discovered the efficiency of digital meetings in a much bigger way. And of course, the technologies allow that. So there will be less, there will still be a growth in it, of course. So globalization is very good. What we've also learned from the pandemic, of course, is that globalization has two sides. The good side, which brings progress, brings opportunities, the reason for so much progress around the world, including in China, of course. But it also is very dangerous. And what we see with the pandemic is that we saw it with the financial crisis, we see it with cyber attacks, we see it also with the unintended consequences like climate change. So globalization requires management. Without management, it is a very dangerous force. And clearly the WTO is one of the central global institutions for management, but there are others like the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and many others, which we also need to make sure are effective in order to more effectively manage globalization.
Okay, yeah, thanks for your views. So Professor Yang, do you have something to say?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's really a great opportunity to learn from a real expert on the globalization at this moment. So I have a question on the globalization to Professor Goldin. What will be the end of the globalization? So globalization to many people means the convergence. Means people all around the world will have the same way of living, like what we here have electricity lights, we have computers, we have cell phones, all the same, traffic, airplanes, everything will be the same. So my question was that, what will be the end? What will be the end of the globalization? Would there, in 10 years or in 20 years, more and more way of living would be the same, or is there will be still a diversity? And what will be the diversity? What will be something that could not be globalized? So if I may, I wanted to learn from Professor Goldin. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Yang. I want to learn from you too, so I'll get some opportunities to ask questions. That's a fascinating question. Since the beginning of globalization, and I think the current phase of globalization, I really identify starting in around about the late 1980s. Uruguay round of trade negotiations, capital account liberalization, opening of China, that started before, of course, but the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union, Maastricht Treaty 92, NAFTA around there. This is really when, and the development of the World Wide Web in 1990 as well. So for me, the current phase of globalization really is been going for about 30 years since 1990. And at the beginning of it, there was a lot of worry that it would lead to homogenization. Particularly not only from Asian countries, but the French were deeply worried that they would lose their French identity. The Brazilians, the Mexicans, everyone was against globalization because they just thought they would be overwhelmed by the US, particularly dominating in terms of politics, in terms of culture, that everyone would eat hamburgers and wear Levi jeans. And there would be, but what we've discovered in the last 30 years is actually globalization has not led to homogeneity. It's led to more and more diversity. I don't think people in China, although they might have an iPhone or they might, you obviously have your McDonald's and Starbucks and so on. But I don't think people feel that they've lost Chinese identity. And I don't think that people feel that in Britain. However, the failure to manage it is leading to pushback. I believe Brexit is an anti-globalization movement. Although Britain says they're doing it in order to be more global Britain, I think it's really a nationalism to make the wall around the island higher. And I think Trump was also an anti-globalization president. And neither of those would have happened, I think, if it hadn't been for the financial crisis. It was really when people lost their jobs and got very, very worried about the crises that globalization spreads, that they became anti-global. I don't think it was a cultural thing. I don't think it's about diversity. I think it's about jobs and incomes and whether globalization benefits everyone or a small elite. And that is really what the story, at least in Europe and in, I think, the US is. That globalization has been associated with increasing inequality. The global jet set, offshore tax havens, companies allocating their profits to offshore places, governments becoming weaker, and less redistribution, and the association of globalization with Thatcherite, Reagan, austerity swing. So my own view is that we will not see homogenization. My hope is that everyone in the world will escape poverty. Everyone in the world will have electricity, will have medicine, will have education, will have a decent life because of globalization. But I do not see that leading to less diversity. I think what it would also spread is communities of ideas. And what you discover on the internet is extraordinary growth of people that were sharing ideas now coming together. They thought they were isolated, but whether it's a music form that was dying out or a language that was dying out, you find new communities rediscovering each other. And actually, I believe globalization is compatible with more diversity, not less. And that's, of course, goes also to an area that you're expert in, which is the protection of traditional ideas, of traditional medicines, of intellectual property, and how that is associated with separate cultures and identities. So I'm very positive about the prospects. What worries me about globalization is not homogenization. It's not the failure to manage it, the crises. And that's what we're living in now.
Thank you. So do you have a quantitative or qualitative study on the percentage of the globalization? How much would be globalized and how many would still be left on globalized? This is a silly question. I know this is a silly question.
No, well, I mean, what measure, you can define your measurement. I mean, what we've seen on poverty, the number of people living in the world, say under $1.90 a day, which is the World Bank absolute poverty level, you can track that, and you can relate it to globalization. And the story is mainly China, of course, because China has been so successful in overcoming extreme poverty. But it's also true in Africa and South Asia, India and elsewhere, Latin America. You can track nutrition, you can track girls' education, you can track life expectancy, you can track many, many, many things. And of course, you can track the bad things too, like carbon dioxide emissions, like plastics in the oceans. So there's a lot, I do track, and the book I finished last year called 100 Maps to Survive the Next 100 Years, Terra Incognita, which is being translated into Mandarin, is full of this tracking. So you can track it. The globalization as a whole, that depends what you put into the bundle. There is a globalization index. DHL, the courier company, has created a globalization index called the Connectedness Index. But that's just, they pick, I can't remember how many, they pick maybe 100 different items and put it into the index. But what's important, and you can also track the bad things. You can track cyber attacks, or you can whatever you want, climate change. But you can track it, but I think one needs to look at the different things rather than the aggregate.
Thank you.
Okay.
Today you are unmuted.
Okay, yeah, so sorry to interrupt you. So we go to another question. As we know, the World Bank's group has two goals, just like Professor Goldin said. One is to end extreme poverty, and the other is to promote shared prosperity in a sustainable way. So as we know, Professor Goldin, you was the Vice President of World Bank. So my next question is, what's the role of the World Bank and the WTO in promoting the globalization and the world economy, in particular in today's situation? Yeah, thank you.
You want me to start?
Yeah.
Okay.
Please.
Yes, those are the goals of the World Bank. And of course, poverty is multidimensional. So poverty is income, but poverty is also education, nutrition, life expectancy, girls' education, discrimination, inequality, etc. So the World Bank's mandate is very wide, particularly on the shared prosperity. What's very important to understand about all these organizations, and Professor Yang knows this deeply in the context of WTO and trade, is that they basically represent global shareholders. And what's very different about the WTO to the World Bank is that in the World Bank, like in the IMF, the shareholding is not one country, one vote. The shareholding is locked into a very out-of-date power structure formed when the institutions were formed in Bretton Woods 75 years ago. And that is a big problem, because the US and Europe basically dominate the shareholding, and the rule in the, it's informal rule, it's not written anywhere, that the president of the World Bank has to be is nominated by the US president, and the head of the IMF is nominated by Europe. That bargain between Europe and the US is a big problem and needs to be ended, because the institutions preach transparency, competitiveness, the best person should get the job, but not the heads of the organization. And that inconsistency is a problem. So the World Bank is shareholders are responsible for it, just like the WTO. And when I was at the World Bank and I was head of policy for the World Bank Group, I thought we were doing many good things, but we also could improve some things. And what I discovered was that to change policy, you need to basically change the minds of the shareholders when it's a significant policy. And that becomes political. So the World Bank is the best institution by far in development in the world. Its staff of over 10,000 people are extremely, on average, highly skilled and recruited competitively, except for the president. The president is the exception. And the president is a political appointment, and really the only political appointment. There sometimes can be a managing director that's a political appointment. So does that matter? It matters if something is very big and strategic. It doesn't matter for 95% of what the bank does, because most of what the bank's doing is on operations in countries which are not controversial in terms of the shareholders. Things only become really difficult if they become very political. But I think the World Bank has evolved, is evolving, and needs to evolve much more rapidly to be effective. Like all the institutions, it is got too much stuck in the past. The world has changed, and the bank needs to change more rapidly. But that is not the bank's choice. That's the choice of the shareholders. And we shouldn't blame institutions for their failures. We should blame the shareholders, which means our governments, for not changing them. And in that case, you have to look at who dominates the World Bank.
Yeah, thank you. So coming back to the question, what does WTO do to promote the globalization and the world economy? To me, WTO is a forum, is a place to make rules, to negotiate and make rules, to provide a level playing field for the international trade. For example, WTO has rules like national treatment, to treat the national domestic goods and import goods equally, and most favored nation treatment, which means to treat the goods from different origins, different countries equally. And WTO also prohibit so-called quantitative restriction, also provide transparency, and also so-called tariff or concessions binding. Once you have concessions on tariffs or on the service sectors, you cannot retreat. You just, it is bound. So this kind of rules are made by the WTO. And so in this way, WTO promote the globalization or international trade and the world economy. So my understanding to the World Bank is very different. I know very little about the World Bank, but does the World Bank care about projects only or mostly, while WTO cares about the rules? So correct me, Professor Goldin, if I'm wrong.
I think that's right. WTO is about the rules, and the World Bank is an investment. It's a bank, it's an investor. On the other hand, the World Bank is very influential also on policy. So, the World Bank makes at times a condition of lending that governments change their policies, like open up more. You asked the question, Dr. Penn, about what it does about globalization. It encourages globalization by encouraging countries to have more open economies. By as incomes rise, of course, people buy more goods and services. But the World Bank also focuses on what it calls global public goods, which are not national but global. So it has a very big activity, for example, on climate change, and manages on behalf of the shareholders, which is all the countries in the world effectively. It manages carbon trading, for example, CDM. It does this in other areas. It's very active on vaccination programs now. It is project-based, but especially on global public goods, these often have a policy dimension which is global, and it supports global trade. It has a very big program to support, for example, behind the border trade measures to improve customs facilities, to improve testing, to improve infrastructure, ports, airports, logistics, all of those things. So they do enhance globalization and they do make countries more resilient. But your distinction is, I think, essentially correct, Professor Yan.
Okay, yeah, thanks again. So our first three questions are mainly related to globalization, like what is globalization? And the following questions are much more related to trade and global governance. So next question is, maybe we can start with Professor Yang. So in your mind, in your understanding, what are the current crises for the world trading system? So can you say something about it?
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah.
Let me start and see whether Professor Goldin has any question on this. People right now are talking about two crises for the WTO, for the world trading system. Number one is appellate body crisis, which was also raised by you on pre-list number 5, the second question. And the next, second crisis is the so-called WTO reform. So to me, WTO reform in the sense of updating the rules. The rules are made 25 years ago, and there are e-commerce, there are globalization, even more globalization than 25 years ago. So rules need to be updated. So to me, appellate body crisis is separate from the systematic WTO reform crisis. So which means that the appellate body crisis could be solved separately, and easily to me. So appellate body crisis could be solved separately and easily. While WTO reform, the updated rules would need sophisticated negotiations, how to make consensus, and some of the questions you raised to us before this session was also related to the decision making, for example. So this is basically my understanding for the crisis for the WTO, for the World Trade System. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Professor Yang. And so let's, Professor Goldin, so in your mind, how will the COVID-19 pandemic affect the global governance? So.
In one respect, I think COVID-19 is a reflection of the failure of global governance. Really, we should be able to stop pandemics if we had an effective global health monitoring and response system. So the WHO is a very good organization. It's been very successful in many things in the past, but it needs urgent reform. It needs funding, a massive increase in funding, and it needs improvement in technical capacity, and it needs more authority globally to be able to fulfill its mandate. It's sort of ironic that the US was so influential in its formation and the development, and then withdrew at the most critical moment in its history during the pandemic. But the commitment of the US, of China, of Europe, particularly to the WHO is absolutely essential. Of course, the impact of the pandemic is not only a health impact. We're now seeing the need for vaccines. We need a much more effective coordination mechanism globally for the manufacturing distribution of vaccines, including to developing countries. COVAX is a good organization, but it needs reinforcement and reform. And of course, the big impact is economic. What we've seen is a failure of global governance economically. What the G20 has done is too little too late. The rich countries have allocated now $15 trillion for themselves. That's between 15 and 20% of their GDPs. And less than 100 billion, so less than 1%, has gone to developing countries. After the financial crisis in 2008-9, there was a heads of state meeting. George W. Bush, another Republican in the White House, called that. He was in very close contact with China. China had a massive response, bigger than the rest of the world put together, to the financial crisis. And this really stabilized the world economy. Now there's virtually nothing happening. What the G20 is doing is extremely small compared to what it did after the financial crisis. So there's a real risk. The World Bank has estimated 125 million more people will fall back into absolute poverty because of the pandemic. This is a disaster. This is the biggest development disaster of all of our lifetime. It's set back the achievement of the SDGs dramatically. It's derailed the SDGs. This requires a very big global effort. And the World Bank and the IMF and other institutions could play a role, but they have not been given the mandate and the resources to step up sufficiently. They're doing what they can, but they are not doing enough. So it's a failure of global governance in many ways. My hope is that it's a wake-up call, that after the pandemic, we see the recommitment to global institutions. That requires that three key groups coordinate, and that the tensions between the US and China particularly are overcome. You cannot have global governance effective in a world of tension between the US and China. These two pillars are absolutely essential, and the third pillar is the European Union. Without those three pillars, there cannot be global governance. And that's why the political tensions between the US and China that are currently being discussed in Anchorage are so important. we cannot underestimate the importance of the US and China working together. When the US and China work together effectively with the European Union, we can fix global governance. If they do not, we cannot fix it. And this is why it's a very important moment in my view.
So if I may, I would like to add one exception to Professor Goldin's comments on the globalization. On the pandemic issue, according to my study, my personal study, WTO did pretty well, or still doing pretty well in this pandemic. You know, the WTO secretaries was working, and the WTO members were restraining themselves from taking restrictive measures, and global international trade are increasing. So, and the rules, WTO rules, as I said, national treatment, most of national treatment, all this kind of rules are working. So according to my study, WTO is working pretty well in trade area. So this may be one of the few exceptions to this effect, the pandemic effect on the global governance. Thank
you. Okay, thank you. So, so our second session is about the WTO reform and the trade crisis and the global governance. So now we'll go to the third session. So because we know most audience are from United Kingdom, so our third session is about the UK's Brexit. And so my question to Professor Goldin. So in your mind, what are the impacts of the UK's Brexit, and how will the UK rebuild its trading relationship with other partners after Brexit? As we know, as I know, in 2010, the UK has signed the trade and cooperation agreement with like EU, Turkey, and Vietnam and Canada. So how will the UK rebuild its trade relationship with its partners? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Well, in my view, Brexit is a huge error on the part of the British government. I've said publicly, along with almost all 99% of the leading economists in Britain, that it's a massive mistake. And it's going to come at a very big cost, not only to Britain and the British people, but also I believe it's very bad for Europe, because I think Britain played a good role in Europe and reinforced Europe, made Europe stronger, and a stronger Europe, I believe, is a good thing. But for Britain, we will see this year it reinforcing negative growth. We've already seen a very, very significant decline in trade, not only with the European Union, which is by far our biggest trade partner. About half of British trade is with Europe, because it's only it's only 35, 40 kilometers away. So we've seen trade, but also we've already seen a massive loss in jobs in the financial sector, going to Amsterdam, going to Frankfurt and elsewhere. And we will see a continuing outflow of investment in other sectors as well. So it's very negative, and it diminishes the role of the UK. It will accelerate the decline of the UK out of the top 5 economies in the world. As soon it will accelerate it out of the top 10. So this is accelerating the decline of the UK. Yes, it does create some other opportunities, but none of these opportunities were excluded before, because Europe already had free trade agreements with many of the countries that Britain is now trying to sign an agreement with. So it's not getting better terms than it would have got through Europe. Europe has negotiated a very good trade agreement with China, with US, with Australia, with others. These agreements take a very long time. Professor Yang has been in the negotiations, but a trade agreement takes a long, long time, and they're getting more and more complicated because they're increasingly on consumer preferences and sorts of areas which are not simply tariffs and manufacturing. So my own view is that the idea of global Britain is a misunderstanding. Britain's global role will decrease because it will be less important in Europe, which is, with China and US, the most significant political and economic power in the world. Britain on its own cannot have the weight or power that it would have had through Europe and with Europe. It will become a smaller economy relatively globally, more rapidly, and that will further undermine its weight. The visa and other restrictions are proving very difficult, including for Chinese students in the UK. So we rely heavily in Oxford and elsewhere on European funding for our research. I have a big research program from Europe. I'll never get that again, I think. A lot of our academics, a lot of our students are European. They will find it more expensive and more difficult to come here. So it's very difficult to think about how Britain will become more global or more effective, in my view. Of course, I'm not the government. They'll tell you a different story. The potential for independent action is there, but it was always there before. Britain could, we're hosting the COP. We arranged to host the COP a long time ago. That doesn't depend on membership of Europe or not. Britain has always played an independent role. Its Commonwealth relationships are very significant. It has other arrangements, but this, in my view, will slow things down. So yes, we need to negotiate a lot of trade agreements. Part of the problem is we don't have the people, because we were negotiating as part of Europe, we didn't have a big domestic trade capacity. And that is, we have to build. You can't create an experienced trade negotiator in a year. This takes a long time to create an experience. And when you're trying to negotiate 40 agreements at the same time with a very weak and inexperienced team, you have a big problem. We also have to build the capacity, the customs capacity, the inspection capacity, the phytosanitary capacity. All of these capacities that were done through Europe have to be built domestically. It's all highly skilled work. And that doesn't happen overnight either. So this will take time, and I'm afraid it takes a lot of money too. And so we need to be patient, I think, to see the effect of this. We are where we are. I know everyone needs to support Britain being more effective. We cannot wind the clock back to being part of Europe. That's a big job, to be an effective trade partner going forward.
So to me, Brexit is a tragedy. But if there is only one merit, that is we are seeing more people from Britain at the other side of the table. And for example, next month, we'll be expecting a professor from Britain to talk about EU-China investment treaty. So which we didn't see before, right? We only see people from Brussels before, but right now we see people from Great Britain. It's just a joke. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both of you. And now, because the time is limited, so let's move over to the final session. The question much related to the negotiation and the RTA, we call it a regional trade agreement. So the question is, in your mind, what are the impacts of the RCEP and the CPTPP to the world trading system? And will it possible for China and the UK to join the CPTPP? And what are the barriers for them to join? Yeah, thank you. So maybe we can start with Professor Goldin. Yeah, you first.
I think this is, I would defer to Professor Yang on this question.
Thank you very much. I was very happy to to hear that the Great Britain is requesting to join the CPTPP. So in that, and China was also actively, positively considering joining the CPTPP. So China and the UK could meet in the CPTPP forum, right? And I guess that UK, when UK wanted to join the CPTPP, it will be more than welcome, right? But the case is not necessarily be the same for China, right? When China says that at the end of last year to possibly considering joining the CPTPP, we're still waiting for the responses from the TPP members, and we are even still waiting for the response from the ex-CPTPP member, that is United States, right? So we are still waiting. So things will be different. But as I said at the very beginning of my academic interest, I'm really interested in the CPTPP and its impact on the legal system in China. Does China need, how many laws China need to change to accommodate the CPTPP rules? Because CPTPP rules seems to be very high to China. And for RCEP, it's different. China has signed the RCEP with ASEAN, with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and similar countries. So that is signed, and that impact would not be that much. So RCEP and TPP would be very different. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Yang. So, Professor Goldin?
I don't really have much to add. I think, you know, it's such a distant for the UK trading arrangement where we will be a very small player in something which has been developed over time. There is this tilt to Indo-Pacific for the UK, and this would really would be helpful for that. But the economic geography is really important, and in trying to think about what are the comparative advantages. It's also very important for me, as someone concerned with development, that Britain does not give up and substitute its trading arrangements with Africa, particularly, and Commonwealth countries for the TPP countries, so I think it, you know, for the UK, I do not see it as a big player in that region. I just I know it's talked about politically here as a substitute for Europe, but it's just very difficult to imagine how that could be possible, given the daily flows that come from Europe, or places that will be nearby, like North Africa, for example, or even the US and Central America. So significant, but largely, I think, political.
Okay, thank you. So actually, I have several questions to ask, but we can find in the question books more than 10 questions. So maybe in the last 5 minutes, we may choose one or two questions from them. So maybe we can choose this question. The question is from the audience is what kind of economic factors determine interdependence between effectiveness of realizing of the climate change innovations and innovativeness of manufacturing basis of the state. Thank you. So, Professor Goldin?
Yeah, interesting
question. Like to answer? Yeah.
Interesting question. If I understand the question right, it's about how countries' ability to make the transition to zero carbon and mitigate the impact of climate change relates to their domestic capacity. on innovation. It's very important. I mean, China is really in the forefront of this, has the biggest capacity for renewables, and is making the biggest investment, and is of course a global exporter massively of renewable technologies. But it's also an area where there needs to be a lot of sharing. You know, in the Paris Agreement of 2015, the rich countries agreed to give $100 billion a year for technological transfers and assistance for countries to meet the Paris targets. That hasn't happened. But countries should be able to buy technologies that will make this transition. So buy the power, the solar panels or the wind turbines, and I believe there should be much more lenient intellectual property around it as well, like with health issues, because it's meeting a global crisis. We're running out of time, so I'm not going to take longer.
Professor Yang, would you like? Okay, so we have 1 minute left. Maybe I can ask my final question, because actually I asked some of my students to participate in this great event. So maybe this question from them. The question is for our speakers. So what are your suggestions for the role in promoting the global cooperation in the future? Yeah. I mean, for the young generations, what are your suggestions for the role in promoting the international cooperation in the future, and how they contribute the world? Okay, Professor Goldin, any suggestion for young students for the studies, or even, yeah?
My view is that people should study what they're passionate about. If they're passionate in science, they should study science. If they're passionate about arts or humanities, they should study that. Whatever they do, they should excel by studying in what interests them. The world is a wonderful world, but it needs to improve in many, many dimensions. And we rely on young people to take forward the struggle to improve it globally. There's a huge amount to be done, and it's very important that everyone does it, but they do it out of the basis of standing on the shoulders of those that came before, by understanding what the knowledge is and improving it, not repeating it, not repeating the failures of the past, but trying to learn from them, and working with others. You know, my great worry is that people are becoming too individualistic, that there's too much I, there's too much me, there's not enough us and we. And you cannot improve societies if you're only looking after yourself. Look after yourself by looking after the world you live in, and you will have a happy future.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, Professor Yang?
Yeah. So my suggestion would be that to follow the developments of the globalization. Globalization is happening. No matter whether we like it or not, but it is happening. So follow the developments of the globalization and think about it, and discuss with yourselves, and so that you could be more capable and more knowledgeable about the global developments. So one day, maybe you will be coming to the stage of diplomacy. So that will be a time for you to work. Thank you.
Okay, because time's up, so thank you all again. Thanks for your insightful views. So thanks for your contribution. So have a nice weekend. So
Thank
maybe
you very
we can
much.
stop here.
Thank you.
Yes,
Nice
thank
meeting you,
Thank
Professor Yang.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Take care, everyone.
Professor Goldin, thank you very much.
Great pleasure.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
to all the audience. Yeah. See you.